Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Some of the roaring, struggling beasts were stronger than the others, and managed to make their way far off into the distance, where a mirror-like object was visible, into which they disappeared. Bai Xiaochun looked around at everything that was happening, and then reviewed some of the information he had gathered in recent days. The ranking system of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstars is divided into different colors, 7 in total. The first level of the trial by fire is the red level, and is the simplest of all. You have to get through this sea of flames. As long as you get 30% into the sea itself, your personal star will rise up in the rankings. The key is how far you can get, that determines your final ranking. After a certain point, you can go right to the next trial by fire. The number of people who actually reach the very end of the red trial is very small. Sighing softly, he looked at all of the countless beasts rushing out into the sea of flames, their miserable shrieks echoing out as they died. As of this moment, he was more impressed than ever by the Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstars. No wonder people go so crazy over the rankings. I've never seen anything like this. So, to get through this first level, you're supposed to use one of those beasts. With that, he patted his bag of holding to produce a 7-colored jade pendant, which he had purchased earlier for a few merit points. This jade pendant was designed specifically for the Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstars trials by fire, and by crushing it, the owner would be safely teleported out of the trial by fire in the blink of an eye. It would also keep a record of the person's accomplishments and how far they had proceeded. Of course, throughout the years, there were always people who didn't crush the jade pendant fast enough, and ended up dying. Bai Xiaochun stepped closer to the edge of the cliff. He could tell that flight was prohibited in this area, leaving him with no choice but to leap down and try to land on one of the beasts flying out from the base of the cliff. After looking down for a moment, he jumped out and began to speed down toward a crimson anaconda that was just flying out over the lava. When Bai Xiaochun slammed onto the flame anaconda, it twisted back and forth in an attempt to hurl him off of its back. However, Bai Xiaochun stamped his right foot down, sending out a burst of power that instantly cowed it. Eyes shining with madness, it continued to speed along. All the beasts in this place knew that as long as they could reach the final destination, they would have their freedom. For them, this red trial by fire was actually a prison. Alright, be a good little snake and go a bit faster. Bai Xiaochun nervously maintained his position on the flame anaconda as it sped along for about the time it takes half an incense stick to burn. As he proceeded along, he noticed that not only did the sea down below grow choppier, but also that he wasn't alone. He saw about 7 or 8 other cultivators, some of whom attempted to switch mounts mid-flight to be able to get further along into the sea. There were even 2 of them who cast covetous gazes at Bai Xiaochun's mount. After all, he was riding a flame-type beast, which could last longer than other beasts in these intensely hot conditions. That's a flame anaconda. Flame-type beasts aren't very common here. Both of those cultivators quickly steered their own mounts in Bai Xiaochun's direction, clearly hoping to snatch his beast. What are you people doing? Bai Xiaochun shouted angrily. Both of the cultivators were in the mid-core formation stage. None of them said anything, and in fact, after eyeing him for a moment, they both unleashed attacks upon the sea of flames below, causing a huge wave of lava to suddenly roll in his direction. There was no time for Bai Xiaochun to get angry. As the heat surged toward him, he suddenly realized that he was probably on the verge of being burned to a crisp. Screaming, he dodged to the side, and yet still managed to get splashed. A moment later, he suddenly stopped screaming, and looked down in surprise at his arm. Although some holes had been burned into his garment, the skin beneath hadn't been harmed at all. Bai Xiaochun blinked a few times, which was when some more drops of burning lava filled the air around him. Instead of trying to avoid them, he let them land on him, whereupon they burned through his clothing down to his skin. However, all he felt was a bit of a warm sensation, not the scalding pain he had anticipated. At that point, his eyes lit up. Not too far off, the 2 cultivators who had been closing in on him with ill intentions looked on with incredulous expressions on their faces. He wasn't hurt? Does he have some sort of magical item protecting him? Wait, that's impossible. Magical items aren't allowed in this trial. Even as they looked on in shock, Bai Xiaochun reached his right hand down into the lava below, and even swept it back and forth a few times. So nice and warm, he said excitedly. When the other 2 cultivators saw that, their eyes nearly popped out of their skulls. Impossible, heavens. He actually stuck his hand into the lava. What the? As for Bai Xiaochun, he couldn't have been more excited, and immediately threw his head back and laughed uproariously. What kind of a sea of lava is this? I thought it was supposed to be scary. Looking very pleased with himself, Bai Xiaochun stepped off of the flame anaconda and dropped down into the lava. Almost immediately, his clothing burned away, revealing his body beneath, absolutely unharmed in any way. He even seemed to be enjoying himself. Not bad at all. Then he looked up at the two cultivators who had been on the verge of attacking him, and were now staring back at him with faces as white as sheets. Before Bai Xiaochun could do or say anything against them, they pulled out their 7-colored jade pendants, crushed them, and faded away. Clearly, they had been worried that Bai Xiaochun might try to get back at them by unleashing some sort of deadly attack. Cowards, he shouted smugly. Get back here, come down and have some fun in the lava with me. With that, he turned and began to swim forward through the lava. Soon, he caught sight of other cultivators in the trial, and when they saw him, they immediately let out cries of shock and disbelief. What's that? Is that a person? Heavens! There's actually someone swimming through the lava. That lava is hot enough to melt unfathomatium metals. Could that thing be some sort of beast in human form? As such cries filled the air, Bai Xiaochun swam along casually, feeling very proud of himself. He even took the time to wave to some of the other cultivators. Why don't you come down and join me? It's very nice and warm. Soon, he had swum 30% into the sea of lava, which was the requisite point to make the rankings. That was when, all of a sudden, a new star lit up on the crimson portion of the rainbow outside. Of course, the crimson part of the rainbow was filled with countless stars, so the appearance of a new one wasn't necessarily something very incredible. However, every time a star appeared for the first time, it would shine more brightly than normal to attract the attention and envy of those looking on. Hey look, a new star. Someone got promoted. Let's see who it is. Bai Xiaochun? I've never heard of him. Normally speaking, there would have been more discussion about the topic, but considering that Zhao Yidong was in the middle of making an important run, most people were focused on his star. In fact, there were even some people who had special types of command medallions with which they could watch the competitors inside of the trials. Obviously, such medallions were extremely expensive, so people wouldn't waste them on a cultivator who hadn't made it into the top 1000. Because no one would ever think to use such a method to observe Bai Xiaochun, nobody on the outside knew that he was swimming through the lava. However, many people in the trial by fire itself saw him, and their cries of shock continued to ring out ceaselessly. Furthermore, Bai Xiaochun could achieve quite a bit of speed while swimming, such that he was actually faster than a lot of the flying beasts. He even started humming a little tune as he picked up speed. Anytime he started to feel uncomfortably hot, he would release some frigid qi. Because of that, he always felt wonderful as he headed toward the bank of the sea. This trial by fire is way too simple, he thought. Clearing his throat, he thought about what a pity it was that more people didn't realize he was swimming through the sea of lava. Once I get out, I'll be able to tell people about this, and they'll definitely think I'm super awesome. Excited, he continued to pick up speed until the bank of the sea was just up ahead. Meanwhile, back outside, a few of the spectators happened to notice that one of the stars on the red portion of the rainbow was rising at an unusually fast speed. In fact, it was already approaching the border of the red part of the rainbow. So fast. Who is that? Bai Xiaochun? That's the same guy who just appeared for the first time. What's going on? His star just appeared on the rainbow, and he's already reached the end of the red portion? One of the disciples with one of the special command medallions decided to focus it on Bai Xiaochun's star, to see what type of beast he was using. Within the space of a few breaths of time, his eyes had grown as wide as saucers. His jaw dropped, and then he cried out, How could this be happening? What the cultivator saw was Bai Xiaochun, looking very pleased with himself and even humming a little tune as he swam merrily through the majestic sea of lava. The cultivator's cry of astonishment caused quite a few other disciples in the area to look over and see what was happening. The sight that met their eyes was the cultivator with the medallion shaking physically, his expression flickering between numerous emotions, his eyes so wide it seemed they might pop out of his head. Then, he raised a trembling hand to point at the star that represented Bai Xiaochun. Voice quavering with disbelief, he shouted, He's swimming. Even more people were now looking over, and yet few seemed to understand what the cultivator was talking about. One of the curious disciples even asked, What do you mean swimming? Who? Bai Xiaochun. That guy whose star just started rising. He's actually swimming in the sea of lava. This time, the cultivator's shout was met with complete silence. His words seemed beyond comprehension, and in response, many people looked up at Bai Xiaochun's star. Some of them couldn't resist the temptation, and pulled out their own special command medallions to check the scene out for themselves. When they finally saw for themselves that Bai Xiaochun really was swimming through the lava, they also began to cry out in shock. It's true. He's really swimming. Heavens. This is impossible. I've never seen anyone swim in the sea of lava before. How could this be happening? Is he a man or a beast? Such cries led to even more people paying attention. The sudden turn of events left everyone completely shaken, and soon, more curious disciples began to pay the requisite price to use their command medallions to watch personally. When that happened, more excited reactions could be heard, and soon, the area outside the Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstars trials devolved into a complete commotion. Who exactly is this Bai Xiaochun? Amidst the exclamations of shock, many of the cultivators began sending messages to friends, and some of the generous ones even began to project the images from their command medallions for others to see. More people began to rush over to the area, causing the commotion to grow. The same thing was happening back in the Hall of Devil Slayers in Sky Quarter. Master Cloud Dao had already received word of what was happening. Having pulled out his own command medallion, it was with gaping jaw that he watched Bai Xiaochun swim along through the lava. Bai Xiaochun. Word was spreading rapidly, but Bai Xiaochun had no way of knowing that he was the center of such attention. He was focusing on swimming forward, and also contemplating how wonderful it would feel to show off later in front of everyone. Eventually, he climbed up onto the opposite bank. Jumping up and down a bit to get all the lava off him, he looked down at himself and then proudly threw on another set of clothing. It's been a long time since I took a bath, he said. Feels great. Of course, little did he know that large numbers of people in the sect were watching his every move. That included all of the female disciples, many of whom were blushing, but none of whom looked away for even a moment. Big Fatty Zhang was currently in the Hall of Spirit Enhancement when suddenly, cries of shock began to ring out. After asking curiously what was going on, he was shown an image which was none other than Bai Xiaochun leaping out of the lava. Xiaochun, he said, his mouth gaping. Back in the trial by fire, Bai Xiaochun looked back at the vast sea behind him, then stuck his chin up and flicked his sleeve. With the snap of a finger, Bai Xiaochun reduced this trial to ashes. Sighing, he assumed the pose of a lonely hero, then began to stride away from the sea. As he did, his vision swam, and he left the red trial by fire. When he reappeared, he was in the next trial, the orange one. Meanwhile, back outside, Bai Xiaochun's words and the expression on his face only added fuel to the fire that was the commotion among the onlookers. Many strange expressions could be seen, although no one gave voice to exactly what they were thinking. A dark horse. He's definitely a dark horse. How far do you think this Bai Xiaochun will get? As the discussions raged through the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect, Bai Xiaochun was just appearing in the orange trial by fire. Almost immediately, deafening rumbling sounds filled his ears, and around him, the world trembled. In almost the same moment that he appeared within the orange trial by fire, a mountain-like boulder suddenly began to drop down toward him, moving at incredible speed. Letting out a shriek, he dashed backward, just in time to see the boulder smash into the ground where he had been standing, causing everything to tremble and shake, and even sending crevices snaking out in all directions. Heart-pounding, Bai Xiaochun looked back up, and what he saw left him gasping. The world was completely gray, including the sky and the land. However, that was not the shocking part. Unexpectedly, two enormous stone golems were also there in the world with him. Both of them were tens of thousands of meters tall, and every move they made caused heaven-shaking, earth-shattering rumbling sounds to echo out. Their bodies were constructed of numerous rocks and boulders lumped together, making them look both like statues and like puppets. Most terrifying of all was that they were fighting each other. As they fought back and forth, they let out howls and roars that sounded like thunder. Numerous smaller rocks and stones fell off of them with each blow that landed, which would smash into the ground below, opening up huge craters. Even larger craters would open up when the two stone golems' feet landed on the ground as they took steps. In addition to the quaking of the ground, the fighting giants caused powerful gusts of wind to sweep out in all directions. They also unleashed divine abilities that unleashed stone dragons and stone spikes which wreaked havoc everywhere. Bai Xiaochun's expression flickered as an intense sensation of crisis swept through him. Anxiously dodging the various dangerous elements, he looked around and noticed that there were other cultivators in the area. Those were the other disciples participating in this trial by fire, and all of them were scurrying about like ants as they avoided the falling stones, blasts of wind, and divine abilities, desperately attempting to get past the area in which the two stone golems fought. Unfortunately, that was by no means an easy task. They were caught in the crossfire, like fish who suffered when a castle's walls caught on fire and crumbled into the moat. The two gigantic fighting stone golems put the cultivators down below in extreme danger. Based on what Bai Xiaochun could tell, those stone golems were beyond the level of the nascent soul stage, and were more like the Diva Realm boy who had come to take him from the river-defying sect. As he looked around in shock, he reviewed the information he had studied about the Orange Trial by Fire. The entire world around him was like a prison, with the two stone golems being prisoners who were forced to fight each other constantly as part of their punishment. They were forbidden from directly killing any of the disciples of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect, but the side effects of their combat could. Because of that fact, this particular trial by fire was much more difficult than the previous one. No wonder there are only a few tens of thousands of stars on the orange portion of the rainbow, Bai Xiaochun thought, as opposed to the innumerable amount on the red portion. Furthermore, only a few thousand people are ever good enough to get past this trial by fire and onto the yellow level of the rainbow. With that, he began to cautiously make his way forward, relying on his incredible speed to stay out of danger. Although he wasn't putting on a poor performance, the people on the outside who were watching him had to use up merit points for every second that they continued to observe. Therefore, many people weren't very pleased with what he was doing. What? He literally swam through the red trial by fire. Why is he going through the orange trial like that? That's what I was thinking. I'm not going to waste any more merit points watching this guy. Forget it. Even as people grumbled on the outside, Bai Xiaochun was picking up speed in the trial by fire. Suddenly, a blast of wind bore down on him, within which was half of a stone dragon. Bai Xiaochun's expression flickered, and when he realized that he didn't have time to dodge, his eyes flickered with cold light, and he suddenly spun his left leg out in a sweeping kick toward the dragon. A boom filled the air as the stone dragon exploded, and the wind faded away. Gritting his teeth, Bai Xiaochun shot forward, getting closer and closer to the exit the entire way. However, at a certain point, he stopped in place and looked up at the two enormous stone golems, and as they fought back and forth, his eyes suddenly lit up. Before, the two stone golems hadn't stood out much to him, but now that he was closer, and had had a chance to look at them for a bit longer, all of a sudden, they seemed a bit familiar. If these two stone golems knelt down and stopped moving, then they would look exactly like that statue I saw in the ravine of endless mountains. Gasping, he realized that the more he looked at the giants, the more they looked like that statue. Before long, he was absolutely convinced that they were the same type of creature as the giant in the ravine of endless mountains. If you want to cultivate the living mountain incantation, you have to meld with the mountain, and understand everything about it. You have to gain enlightenment of its spirit, and forget yourself. You have to become a human mountain. When you wake up, you will have completed a circle. The divine ability will be complete, and you will have succeeded in becoming a living mountain. Panting, he looked up at the two fighting stone golems, and suddenly everything became clear. All his previous areas of confusion were destroyed instantly. Eyes flashing with excitement, he murmured, "There is no better place than here, to seek enlightenment of the living mountain incantation." Bai Xiaochun was currently only about 3,000 meters away from the exit of the orange trial by fire. Considering the speed he was capable of, it would only take a bit of effort for him to proceed on to the yellow trial. In fact, there were many other disciples in the area who, despite trying their very best, couldn't make it past the wind and divine abilities to reach the very spot he was standing in. Many of them were shocked that he had made it through so quickly, but none of them were paying much attention to him. After all, they were more concerned with their own situation. The slightest lapse in concentration could leave them crushed to death in an instant. Because of the intense danger, all of the other disciples were essentially risking their lives. The contrast between all the other disciples and Bai Xiaochun, who was simply standing there watching the stone golems fight, was very obvious, and some of the cultivators on the outside who were watching him were taken aback. What's wrong with this Bai Xiaochun? He didn't do anything very special in this section, but he did go really fast. Why doesn't he just go out through the exit? This guy is pretty incredible. He's already in the top 10,000, and once he gets to the yellow section of the rainbow, he'll instantly be in the top 5,000. What's he doing just standing there? As the cultivators on the outside looked on, puzzled, Bai Xiaochun was still trying to decide what to do. As he stood there, various key aspects to the living mountain incantation were unlocked within his mind, and with each second that passed, it became clearer that this was an opportunity he could not afford to pass up on. Unfortunately, his divine sense was restricted within the trial by fire, and could only spread out a few hundred meters. Only being able to observe the giants with his naked eyes was almost like looking at them through a veil. If I could get a bit closer, and observe them with divine sense, then I'm pretty sure I could come to understand these stone golems in a much more complete sense. Eyes bloodshot, he struggled back and forth for a short time before gritting his teeth. If worst comes to worst, I can just use the 7-colored jade pendant to teleport to safety. With that, he burst into motion, not toward the exit but in the opposite direction. Everyone looking on was immediately shocked, but before anyone even had a chance to cry out in shock, Bai Xiaochun became a beam of light speeding across the ground of the orange trial by fire. All of the other cultivators within the trial by fire looked on with wide eyes. What is he doing? At the same time, Bai Xiaochun shot along, heading directly toward the stone golems, and then, maintaining his incredible speed, he began to fly up the legs of the nearest one. From a distance, Bai Xiaochun looked like a tiny bug compared to the enormous stone golem. And yet, he was extremely agile, and quickly scrambled and leapt his way up to the giant's back. Eventually, he reached something of an outcropping where, despite the swaying of the giant's movements, he was able to settle down cross-legged and send his divine sense out to observe the giant. By this point, everyone was gasping in shock, both the cultivators in the trial by fire and the audiences outside watching events play out on the projected screens. He jumped up onto the giant itself? Is this Bai Xiaochun crazy? Wait, is he going to start practicing cultivation? Heavens, what is he thinking? Most people try to get out of that place as quickly as possible. But he actually went backward, and now is going so far as to practice cultivation. It's a trial by fire, not a place for cultivation. Bai Xiaochun's actions were causing a huge stir both inside and outside of the trial by fire. Meanwhile, Zhao Yidong's star was not the subject of much attention anymore. Bai Xiaochun's actions, despite the fact that he was only in the orange trial by fire, were leading to profound shock among the audience. As time passed, word continued to spread through the cultivators of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect, and even more people began to pay attention to what was happening. As for Song Ke, he was in the middle of a session of meditation, when suddenly his bag of holding began to vibrate. Opening his eyes, he produced a jade slip from inside that had a short message from one of his friends. After scanning it, his eyes went wide, and he shot to his feet. Bai Xiaochun? Without any hesitation, he rushed out of his immortals cave and looked over at the orange section of the rainbow overhead. Upon finding one particularly bright star, he focused on it, and moments later, Bai Xiaochun's name appeared in his head. As the commotion in the outside world spread, Bai Xiaochun was inside the trial by fire, doing his best to stay in one place on the back of the giant. Enduring the screaming winds, he sent his divine sense pouring out to observe the internal structure of the stone golem. There was no more suitable place to study this stone golem than the position he had occupied. To meld with the mountain, he murmured, "You have to understand it first." With that, he rose to his feet and began to climb higher up through the cracks and crevices on the back of the stone golem. The entire time, the stone golem was engaged in fierce fighting with its opponent, swaying back and forth amidst heaven-rending, earth-crushing rumbling sounds. On a few occasions, Bai Xiaochun was almost hurled off of the surface of the stone golem, especially whenever the other stone golem landed a blow on it, which caused everything around him to shake violently. Once, the opposite stone giant attacked with a fist strike that summoned a divine ability, leaving Bai Xiaochun coughing up blood. Despite being relatively hidden among the crevices on the giant's back, he still felt as if his inner organs were vibrating on the point of collapse. And yet, determination filled his eyes. Tightening his grip on the rocky surface, he once again sent some divine sense out to understand more about the stone golem. Everyone watching the scene was left gasping, and even the two stone giants had noticed him. However, other than strange gleams which appeared in their eyes, they did nothing, and simply continued to fight. Meanwhile, in another location on Myriad Star Rainbow, outside of the ravine of endless mountains, Stone Mountain was sitting cross-legged on the same greenish-black boulder. Slowly, his eyes opened, and he looked in the direction of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstars trials, his gaze coming to rest on Bai Xiaochun's star on the orange portion of the rainbow. Gradually, a strange light rose up in the man's eyes, and a smile broke out on his face. "Now that's clever," he murmured quietly. Back inside the orange trial by fire, Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath and climbed higher up the giant. By now, he had a fairly thorough understanding of the internal makeup of the enormous stone creature, except for its head. Of course, that was the most dangerous area of all, but Bai Xiaochun was currently engulfed within the living mountain incantation, in much the same way that he often lost himself in concocting medicine. It was with a seeming complete lack of the fear of death that he flew higher, even as the two stone golems battered at each other endlessly. Wings appeared behind him as he pushed on with greater speed, and he even relied on the mountain-shaking bash and the undying tendons in his left leg. Sonic booms echoed out, and a series of afterimages stretched out behind him as he shot upward to appear on top of the stone golem's head. Winds battered him, making it almost impossible to stand still, but he grabbed onto one of the stone hairs sticking out of the giant's head, and then sent his divine sense out with reckless abandon. Apparently, the stone golem did not like its head being interfered with. Frowning, it jerked its head to the side, causing a violent wind to rise up within the trial by fire. Instantly, the other cultivators within the trial began to emit agonized shrieks, and quickly began to crush their jade pendants to teleport away. Bai Xiaochun finally couldn't hold on any longer, and was flung off of the giant's head. At the same time, the huge stone golem began to swing its mountain-like hand toward Bai Xiaochun, almost the way a human would in an attempt to grab a fly out of the air. As Bai Xiaochun watched the huge hand filling his field of vision, his eyes suddenly flashed with enlightenment. Spirit meld. Bai Xiaochun roared, his hands flashing in a double-handed incantation gesture as he used the spirit melding techniques described in the Living Mountain incantation. He had attempted this same thing numerous times in the Ravine of Endless Mountains, and had failed each time. But this time, he suddenly felt something stirring in his mind, a connection of sorts with this enormous stone golem. It was a unique, indescribable connection, almost as if he were melded with the emotions of the giant. He could feel how ancient it was, and could feel its madness and bitterness. He could also sense how much it hated this world, and especially the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect. A tremor ran through Bai Xiaochun, and the same thing happened to the stone golem. Its eyes shone with bright light as it looked at Bai Xiaochun, and suddenly, instead of trying to grab Bai Xiaochun, it swatted at him. Instantly, Bai Xiaochun was sent flying through the air, spinning head over heels toward the exit of the orange trial by fire. Bai Xiaochun barely had time to pant before he was within the teleportation range of the exit, and was sucked away toward the yellow trial by fire. In the moments before he faded away, he looked back to see both of the stone giants standing there staring at him. Moments later, intense rumbling sounds once again echoed out. Apparently, their performance would not conclude for all eternity. They would not rest until they died. Because the same wind that carried Bai Xiaochun to the exit was like a heavenly tempest filling the entire trial by fire, everyone else who was still inside anxiously teleported out as soon as they could. As they reappeared one by one outside of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstars trial, not a single trace of fury could be seen on their faces. Instead, they wore expressions of incredulity and shock. What technique does this Bai Xiaochun cultivate? That stone golem actually took the initiative to send him to the exit. How is that possible? In the red trial by fire, he swam through the sea of lava. In the orange one, the stone golem helped him. Where does this guy come from? As the clamor rose up from the audience, Bai Xiaochun's star climbed from the orange section of the rainbow into the yellow one, to join the several thousand other stars there. That indicated that Bai Xiaochun was now in the top 5,000. Considering the momentous event which was playing out, more and more audience members were personally paying merit points to be able to observe Bai Xiaochun as he made his way through the trials by fire. Meanwhile, as soon as Bai Xiaochun appeared within the yellow trial by fire, he sensed intense, frigid coldness somewhere nearby, and could also tell that the ground was trembling. There was still some of bewilderment in his eyes. The events which had played out in the orange trial by fire were still a bit hard to reconcile. His heart even trembled with a trace of residual fear. Plus, there was the sensation he had experienced when the stone golem reached out to grab him in the end. All of it left him gasping in astonishment. There are way too many secrets in this Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect. Those stone golems were obviously some race of creatures, locked away within the trial by fire. How come these Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstar trials all seem like prisons? He was both trembling with fear and shaking in excitement. After all, he had taken a significant step with his cultivation of the Living Mountain incantation, making progress far beyond anything he had before. All I need to do is get into the top 1,000 so I get the 7-colored misty seagrass. Then I can concoct that medicinal pill, and be strong enough to fully cultivate the Living Mountain incantation. With that, he looked around excitedly at the yellow trial by fire. Despite what he had experienced so far in the red and orange trials by fire, what he saw around him left him profoundly shaken, and deeply moved by the methods of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect. The dimension he was in now was a single room. Standing in the middle of the room was a burly man with a red rope tied around his head. He held a pair of iron tongs in one hand, which he used to hold a red-hot sword in place below him. Further down, below the red-hot sword, was a channel filled with black liquid that seemed cold beyond description, and emanated a frigid aura. The burly man held an iron hammer in his other hand, which he used to hit the sword with all the force he could muster. The resulting booms which rang out were completely deafening. Clearly, this burly man was a blacksmith, and this room was an ironworks. Furthermore, Bai Xiaochun had apparently been shrunk down to a size much smaller than before, and was now standing on the iron tongs. Or perhaps Bai Xiaochun hadn't been shrunk down, and this place was just enormous, with the blacksmith being a giant. Considering the proportions, if that were true, then the blacksmith was no smaller than the stone golems from the last trial. Every time the iron hammer smashed down, the entire dimension shook. Bai Xiaochun's face was completely ashen, and his mind was spinning from the frightening nature of the scenario. Shivering, he looked up at the gigantic blacksmith and his huge hammer, then at the red-hot sword being held by the tongs, and then down at the channel below. From his perspective, that body of water might as well have been a sea. After a long moment of indecision, Bai Xiaochun finally gritted his teeth and charged forward, leaping up onto the red-hot sword. Almost immediately, he could sense the heat rising up into his feet, so he rotated his cultivation base to fight back, and proceeded forward. As he ran along pell-mell, he felt tears welling up in his eyes. This place was simply too hot, and he couldn't help but let out yelps of pain and even leap up into the air. He would have flown if he could have, but flight was restricted in this dimension. Not only was there the heat to deal with, but there was also the enormous iron hammer. It was like an enormous falling star smashing onto the sword, and if he wasn't careful and got struck, Bai Xiaochun knew that his powerful fleshly body would do nothing to protect him, and he would be crushed out of existence. "I'm gonna get myself killed. Killed. Ag," he screamed. "Lord Bai is gonna die from this heat." This heat vastly exceeded the heat from the sea of lava in the red trial by fire, and at the moment Bai Xiaochun wasn't sure if there was anything special that he could do to pass the trial. However, he did remember that above the yellow portion of the rainbow was the green portion, with only about 1,000 stars. That meant that in all of the starry sky Dao polarity sect, only about 1,000 core formation cultivators had passed this trial. Considering how enormously large the starry sky Dao polarity sect was, 1,000 was a very small group of people, and from that, it was possible to determine how difficult this trial by fire was. But Bai Xiaochun was incredibly fast, and also cultivated the frigid school while evolving incantation. By focusing all of his frigid chi in his legs and feet, he was able to counteract the heat to some degree. Although it still hurt, he was able to keep speeding along. As of this point, he had made it about 30% across the sword. Have to go faster, he thought, fearing that he was going too slow. He was like an ant bustling across a hot kettle, and when the people on the outside saw what he was doing, their eyes went wide. They had all seen people challenge this trial, and many of them had attempted it themselves. All of them knew that it was very difficult, and that people usually challenged it only with the greatest caution. In fact, most people spent the majority of their time within the trial just observing the surroundings. After all, this trial was not just about speed or heat resistance but about understanding vibrations. Every time the hammer hit the sword, the entire thing would vibrate, and at the same time, some of the heat would disperse. Simultaneously, one could take advantage of the shaking of the sword to accelerate. By timing things perfectly, one could make each forward movement without being hurt by the heat. This type of test was especially designed to hone the divine sense of the cultivators who took it. With exceptional control, they could reduce the danger significantly. Never before in history had anyone attempted the trial in the way Bai Xiaochun was doing, by just recklessly running forward at top speed. This Bai Xiaochun, this guy is definitely a weirdo who doesn't like to do things the normal way. Outside, people exchanged wry glances as Bai Xiaochun sped along screaming as loudly as a rabbit with its tail on fire. That was especially true when some of the disciples heard the things Bai Xiaochun was muttering under his breath. What kind of crappy trial by fire is this? What is it testing? How well people can get burned? I'm gonna die from the heat. How did everyone else pass the trial? I bet none of them matched up to me. They probably ran crying through the whole thing, or maybe even crawled. Bai Xiaochun himself was on the verge of tears as he flew along, accelerating the entire time. After enough time passed for an incense stick to burn, he was about 70% across. HMMPHHHHH. Bai Xiaochun is the awesomest as usual. Seeing that he was almost at the end, his spirits rose, and although he continued to shriek in pain every so often, he was still very pleased. Now that I think about it, this heat is actually pretty comfortable for my feet. Everyone looked on in complete silence, stunned by Bai Xiaochun's reckless method. From the look of it, he was just about to finish the third trial. There's no way he's going to pass the trial like this. Quite a few people spoke words similar to this as they looked on in envy. Damn it, how come he's going through this third trial so fast? Aren't you supposed to get through based on timing out the vibrations? More and more people began to comment in such a way until Bai Xiaochun was about 90% of the way across and closing in on the end. Bai Xiaochun was feeling very pleased with himself when, all of a sudden, he realized that something wasn't right. Why is the sword moving? Even as he looked around in surprise, looks of delight could be seen on the faces of the people observing on the outside. Apparently, the huge giant working with the sword was happy with the results. Lifting it up with the tongs, he began to stretch it down toward the black liquid in the channel below. Ha ha ha, he's quenching the iron. Bai Xiaochun sure got unlucky. I can't believe he's going to quench the iron. This only happens 1 time out of 10. Bai Xiaochun just got lucky enough to see it. As everyone reveled in Bai Xiaochun's misfortune, he was standing there on the red-hot sword, an agonized shriek escaping his lips. He could see what was happening, but before he could react at all, the giant was plunging the sword, and Bai Xiaochun along with it, right into the black ocean of frigid qi. Bai Xiaochun immediately began to scramble backward, but before he could get more than a few paces, and before he had time to pull out his 7-colored jade pendant, the black liquid was rushing up toward him. No, I don't wanna. When Big Fatty Zhang saw what was happening, he immediately got nervous and cried out, Xiaochun. Chen Manyao was also taken aback. As for Master God Diviner, without even thinking about it, he began to perform an incantation gesture in the hopes of divining some information about Bai Xiaochun's safety. Even Song Ke was completely shocked. As for everyone else, they were also stunned, but at the same time, somewhat happy. However, in the following instant, their expressions flickered wildly. Why isn't he teleporting out? Don't tell me he ran out of time. Maybe he didn't bring in a teleportation pendant? No way. Did he really die, just like that? The sudden turn of events left everyone flabbergasted and unsure of how to react. Based on everything they knew, Bai Xiaochun should have just teleported out as soon as he realized he was in danger. However, after nobody appeared on the outside, they realized that he hadn't even pulled out a teleportation pendant, leading to various reactions. He didn't really die, did he? Well, that is ever frigid water. I've seen a few people fall into it before, and all of them died instantly. Nobody was really completely sure of what to say. The situation really seemed very strange. However, that was when, all of a sudden, the eyes of one of the cultivators in the audience went so wide they almost popped out of his skull. Pointing up at the stars, he shouted, swim. He's swimming again. Quivering, everyone looked up at the climbing star, whereupon gasping sounds began to ring out. Moments before, back in the yellow trial by fire, within the black sea-like channel of water, Bai Xiaochun's head had just popped up into the open. Taking a deep breath, he shivered and looked around, his face looking a bit blue. Where the hell am I? He thought, shivering on the verge of tears. I feel like I'm about to freeze to death. By now, he was convinced that these trials by fire weren't fun at all. They either involved searing heat or freezing cold, and were all a torment. If it weren't for that medicinal plant, I definitely wouldn't come to this place. What kind of a crappy trial by fire is this? At the moment, he was mostly out of options. Flight was restricted, and the sword was nowhere to be seen. Therefore, he decided that he might as well start swimming through the frigidly cold water. Don't tell me this trial by fire is a test of swimming skill? Sighing and shivering, he proceeded to swim forward. As he did, the people watching on the outside devolved into complete chaos. Of course, Bai Xiaochun had no way of knowing that. As he swam along, the freezing cold caused his face to turn bluer and bluer. Even his joints started stiffening up. It was at that point that he realized the frigid qi in the area was actually boring into his pores and swirling into his heaven Dao gold core. Don't tell me the frigid qi here can actually help my cultivation? Without any hesitation, he unleashed his frigid school will evolving incantation, sending frigid qi swirling out from inside of him. In the blink of an eye, it had filled the entire area. In response, the frigid qi in the water around him suddenly began to surge toward him. Cracking sounds could be heard and the sea began to freeze as the qi rushed into Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun's mind was spinning as his heaven Dao gold core rotated with maddening speed, constantly absorbing the frigid qi and building up greater reserves. Delighted, Bai Xiaochun drew even more deeply upon the frigid school will evolving incantation, watching as the absorbed frigid qi caused his heaven Dao gold core to slowly increase in size. At the same time, his cultivation base began to advance. Before, he had been in the mid-gold core stage, but now, he was rapidly approaching the late gold core stage. Furthermore, he was also moving away from the frigid adept level and nearing the frigid master level. This sudden stroke of good fortune left Bai Xiaochun feeling so ecstatic that he couldn't help but cry out at the top of his lungs. Good fortune. Woohoo! This trial by fire is awesome. I can't believe there's so much good fortune to be had. Ha ha ha. Thrilled, he began to absorb the frigid qi at an even more rapid pace. Gradually, a whirlpool began to build up around him as nearly all of the frigid qi within the sea of water began to madly rush in his direction. Eventually, the water ceased being black and started becoming increasingly transparent. One could well imagine how, if all of the water in the sea began clear, it would no longer be a channel of frigidly cold liquid. Everyone on the outside was watching with gaping jaws, completely struck numb by the godlike performance being put on by Bai Xiaochun. Were the Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstars trials made for this guy? He swam through the red trial by fire and sought enlightenment in the orange one. And now in the yellow trial he's practicing cultivation? What's going on? A whole din of voices could be heard, most of them filled with jealousy. Big Fatty Zhang and the other Dao protectors sighed in relief, except for Songke, whose eyelids were twitching, and whose hands were clenched into fists as he thought back to the fallen sword world. Wherever Bai Xiaochun goes, he razes the place to the ground, he growled through gritted teeth. Many people throughout the rainbow districts of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect were now watching Bai Xiaochun, and could hear his exclamations of delight at how his cultivation base was rising. As of this moment, he was only about 3,000 meters away from the exit, but had already stopped swimming and was just floating there, reveling in the feeling of growing stronger. Ha ha ha, this place really is like a holy land for me. Bai Xiaochun watched excitedly as his cultivation base continued to climb. Just when he was thinking that breaking through to the late gold core stage in this place wasn't just a dream after all, he got the intense feeling that someone was watching him. Looking up nervously, he saw that the gigantic blacksmith was staring straight down at him. Bai Xiaochun shivered as an intense sensation of deadly crisis spread through him. As quickly as possible, he stopped absorbing the frigid qi. Okay, I guess I'll leave now. Before he could offer any explanation, the blacksmith howled and began to swing his enormous hammer down toward Bai Xiaochun. Shrieking, Bai Xiaochun began to swim like mad. As the hammer descended, the black liquid in the channel filled with waves from the force of the incoming blow. Blood sprayed out of Bai Xiaochun's mouth as the waves swept him about. Then, he sent frigid qi surging out of him, not for 3,000 meters, but instead for 9,000 meters, causing everything to turn to ice. Although flight was prohibited, Bai Xiaochun could use his frigid qi clones to switch positions in something like a teleportation, which was exactly the method he employed to race toward the exit. Almost as soon as he vanished, the huge hammer smashed down into the spot he had just occupied, shattering the layers of ice and sending a huge shockwave out in all directions. Blood sprayed out of Bai Xiaochun's mouth, and yet, he still managed to accelerate. He was now very close to the exit, but in the blink of an eye, the blacksmith had raised his hammer and was sending it back down. Shrieking, Bai Xiaochun barreled through the exit of the yellow trial by fire and was teleported to the next level. Upon seeing Bai Xiaochun vanish, the huge blacksmith snorted coldly, then looked down at the black water, frowning. He had not swung his hammer with full force just now. If he had, Bai Xiaochun would never have escaped. This blacksmith was different from the stone golems, and was actually on good terms with the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect. As such, when this insect came along and began to steal his frigid liquid, all he could do was drive him away. Everyone who saw what had just occurred was left gasping in shock. In fact, more gasps had come out of the mouths of these disciples than normally could be heard in a whole year. He actually pissed off the guardian. He's not challenging the trials by fire, he's actually there to steal stuff. Angry exclamations and expressions of disbelief could be heard everywhere. Almost no one outside of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity Superstars trials was sure whether to laugh or cry. In any case, this Bai Xiaochun is definitely a top chosen. However he managed it, he's gotten through 3 trials, and is closing in on the top 1,000. Yeah, well let's see how he does in the next challenge. It's incredibly difficult. If he gets past it, he'll be in the top 500. Although Zhao Yidong was already in the 4th challenge, nobody was even paying attention to him anymore. Everyone was looking closely at Bai Xiaochun's star, and wondering how he would fare in the 4th level, the green trial by fire. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.